We'll see if Will or anybody else is able to hop on, but I think in the meantime, we can just kind of go ahead and introduce ourselves. And I'll start with myself, and then I'll just kind of call on people as I see them on my screen. And you can just kind of say who you are, what brings you to being here, and maybe some of your initial impressions and thoughts about the 1922 Robin Hood film. Sound good? So I'm Thaddeus Papke. I'm the host of the Into the Greenwood podcast, and I only watched the 1922 film for the first time a couple of years ago, shortly before I started the podcast. I had always kind of had the expectation that it would be sort of the silent version of the Errol Flynn film, knowing that like Alan Hale was playing Little John in both. And so I kind of never felt like I needed to bother watching it. But then I felt it was my duty before I started the podcast, and like, I'm actually going to get into this, and was surprised that it was as different a film as it was, especially surprised by the knightly elements, how much emphasis there was on Robin Hood as the crusading knight. That was the thing that I think more than anything else surprised me about that film. All right, Emily, how about you?
Well, I am Emily Rich. I'm just kind of around in the Robin Hood fandom more than anything. I don't do anything in particular, except I think I'm most active on Twitter right now. But so for me, the first time I watched the 1922 film was in college. I did a little project, much like your current series on your podcast. I watched all of the Robin Hood films in order. The thing that surprised me the first time I watched it was how engaging it was. It was my first time really watching a silent movie, and I wasn't expecting it to be as engaging as it was. So I overall enjoyed it much more than I thought I would, and I rewatched it in preparation for this chat, and yeah, it really holds up. It's a really fun watch. So.
All right, Leah, how about you?
Yeah, hi, I'm Leah. I'm in the Robin Hood fandom too. I love Robin Hood, and I watched this movie for the first time last night and this morning. So I really was surprised at how violent it was at parts for like a 1920s film, and how like it couldn't decide if it wanted to be a funny film or a serious film. Like it was trying to figure that out, but I loved how joyful it was. I thought that was really, really cool.
Yeah. All right, Nathan?
My name is Nate Makaryk. I've written a couple of books, Robin Hood related, Nottingham and Lionhearts, which were based off of a play that I wrote over a decade ago as well. I'm happy to be here. For me, the 22 version, that was never like my version of Robin Hood. Like that was, I think it's kind of cool that everyone has their own probably version of Robin Hood who is their first really impression. And that one was not mine. So, I went back and watched that probably when I was an adult rather than as a kid. And it's been definitely a lot of years since I've seen it now. I didn't get a chance to rewatch it for this either. But a lot of what I, wrote about it has to deal with kind of the general tropes that everybody knows about Robin Hood. And I feel like a lot of that did kind of originate from the Fairbanks version, the idea, of the scheming Prince John, while they're off in the Crusades, and there's a lot of those, like, just, the stormings of the castles, since that's the kind of like the original version that we have as far as visually recorded goes. I feel like that kind of set the tone for everyone that comes to follow, and that's where a lot of our steps go as far as what we expect a Robin Hood to be. So I think that it's got a lot of legacy there.
Yeah, that's definitely a point that I want to bring up later in our discussion. Mike, how about you though?
Hi everyone, I'm Mike Nichols. I'm a very big Robin Hood fan, as I'm sure you've all had to deal with on Twitter. I wrote a couple Robin Hood plays that were on YouTube during the pandemic, called The Gospel of Friar Tuck. I think I'm a fan of every single person in this chat, and I think with my experience with the 1922 Douglas Fairbanks and Robin Hood film, I watched parts of it in college during a film class. We were doing a section on the silent era. And I remember we watched selected clips from the film, but then I didn't see the full film until like later on. I think I found it for free on YouTube somewhere. And then I rewatched most of it again last week when I knew we were going to do this and talk about it. Yeah, similar thoughts to what everyone's kind of said. I guess one thing that stood out to me that I really didn't remember as well was, and it kind of sounds weird to say for like a black and white silent film, but I thought it was really pretty. Like just the amount of detail and the amount of flowers on everything, or just the amount of flags that were just behind someone's head, the law of thirds of like how shots were set up. I know for a lot of silent film, like it was literally called motion pictures, which meant that everything still had to look like a picture, but just moving. And so many of the frames and the shots that they had in this film do look like illustrative pictures right from, you know, a book that they're just shooting in early cameras. So I think I was just very impressed with how good the cinematography and the, you know, the framing and just like the artwork actually was in the film, for it being like, you know, what we generally consider like a silent film quality value. And then also just, yeah, like it's kind of mentioned, just the practicality they use, like just the stunts were just, oh, that's really a dude jumping from a castle ledge. Oh, that's really a guy climbing up a giant chain moat. That's really a guy just sliding down, you know, a castle, you know, tapestry. And even just the little thing where she's like painting his shadow. Some very unique practical things that they did that really made it feel more natural and realistic than I think even we get with a lot of modern action where it's big and over the top, and yet it doesn't feel as real as somehow this felt, just by doing so much practically and focusing on what could actually be done in front of a camera at that time, which I think in some ways actually made it stronger than some of the more recent Robin Hoods. So yeah, those are some things that stood out to me.
Yeah, definitely a lot there for us to touch on at various points too, I think. Alan, we've got your photo of the Robin Hood statue back up now.
I was able to adjust it. Yeah, so Alan Wright, I run the website boldoutlaw.com, which in its original GeoCities form is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. So
cheers.
Yeah, so I can't remember the first time I saw Douglas Fairbanks. I saw it at the Robin Hood conference in 1997, so 25 years ago, but I had seen it and I recorded it off TV a little before. So I think it might have been the same year that I saw it in 97. So and then I saw it on the big screen at the conference, and I've seen it at a couple of other conferences on the big screen. And I really become a fan of silent films. So looking at it, I don't see it as missing something. I see it as a special medium that's really got its own strengths, and just visually it's wonderful. And just to pick up on what was said before, when I was rewatching it last night, I was thinking you can definitely tell this is pre-film code, which I think was 31, 32 that the film code came in. And so about 10 years after this, because like the torturing of the women and things, and a few things like that, you know, the Errol Flynn film was more suggestive and cartoonish because it was post film code. And also, yeah, the like of painting quality, the sort of pre-Raphaelite quality to Marion, for example, and the images of when she sort of ghostly appears in Robin's mind to him with the sword. I mean, it is a really strong film, and yeah, and just to say, when I think it was Nate who said everyone has their own Robin Hood, I got into it, I think, from the Rocket Robin Hood cartoon. I'm pretty sure my first Robin Hood is different than everyone else's.
Yeah, that's a pretty unique one.
Well, not if you're Canadian of my generation on sides, because it reran for decades here. So, but yeah, no, it's a fantastic movie. And
whereas I'd never heard of
this.
Rocket Robin Hood until just recently. Kristen commented that she remembers you showing an episode of the Rocket Robin Hood at
Yeah,
a conference.
I think the one where we met in Wales, I did a presentation on it because it was a sort of last minute whether I was going to go or not. So I cobbled something together where I did a bunch of clips of it.
I definitely watched a few episodes recently on YouTube, like within the past year or two. It is a very fun show.
Yeah, but yeah, the Fairbanks one, I've grown to like it more and more watching silent films and things and just getting the sense of what it is and the sort of performances. And I just saw on the Criterion channel a few weeks ago, I saw a movie from the 1950s. I looked at the director's credits and said Alan Dwan. I'm like, wait, the Alan Dwan? Like he was doing movies 30 odd years after Robin Hood, and he had a 50-year career
Wow.
as a director.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so he continued on, whereas Douglas Fairbanks died in like 1939, I think. So yeah.
Kristen, do you want to unmute long enough to introduce yourself or say anything else in the chat?
Let's see if that works. I'll unmute real quick and say hi.
Yeah.
Very much wrapped up in blankets with tea and a cat and student paper drafts to go over. And so I'll stay off camera. I'm also one of the Robin Hood Association people. Been friends with Alan for, gosh, how many years was that? That Wales
Well,
conference?
we met Wales, so yeah, 2007.
Gosh, we are getting old. My students asked me what a phone book was a few years ago. And I've published a bit on various Robin Hood things, food, feasting, romance novels. I actually taught the Fairbanks film a couple years ago, and it was an interesting experience. The students who liked it, very much liked it, several of them actually wrote about it. Some of them were very bewildered by it. And I think that in part responds to some of the, it's a film that benefits from having context for it and some knowledge of the Robin Hood tropes and stories. But some of the students who came into it not knowing anything were very fascinated because they had an idea of who Robin Hood was that they realized matched up with this film so well, despite not having seen it, which is something that's fascinating. It has this kind of cultural currency, even if they've never watched the film.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess one of the questions that I wanted to ask everybody here is, what are the elements of the film that you think have been the most informative to our understanding of Robin Hood now, and which are the ones that aren't?
I'll jump, please.
Okay, I think something that I noticed even when I first watched it is that this general plot line that they use, maybe not quite so much with the heavy-handed crusader first half of the film, but the whole general idea of Robin comes back from crusade, everything is wrong, like that. The plot of this film is the plot of almost every other Robin Hood film after it. I've said a few times, I think Hollywood only knows how to make one kind of Robin Hood film, and this is the prototype for that film. And Hollywood and movies tend to be where many people's understanding of Robin Hood comes from. So I think in that way, this film did have a really big impact.
Yeah, I think it's one of the Robin Hood films that feels the most like, say, the Kevin Costner Robin Hood film than other early ones do, even more like more than I think Errol Flynn. I think this film feels like the Kevin Costner one.
And not just Kevin Costner, but the Richard Green series in the 50s, and then the 2010, 2018. I mean, Robin's Crusader, I was going to say that is, and I feel like there's two big influences. One is Ivanhoe, which is
right.
And I hear that Douglas Fairbanks was considering doing a straight Ivanhoe adaptation. was
That is-
one of the things on the table.
I read that as well. Yeah.
And you can see that. And the other is to give credit where credit is due, and I was hoping she'd be on tonight, but Professor Lorraine Stock dug up the sequel to Reginald de Koven and Harry B. Smith's operetta. The original one was called Robin Hood, and when it played in England, it was actually called Maid Marian because Robin Hood was already in use. But then they did a sequel in America called Maid Marian. That's totally different. That had a decent run. And the other night I tracked it down and I was saying to Lorraine, look, Douglas Fairbanks' first Broadway roles in New York were at the same time Maid Marian was playing. So he would have seen it. And that has Robin go on the Crusades. He goes to Jerusalem as part of the plot. So she thinks that was an influence on this version of Robin Hood. And I can completely believe that. And then I think everything else came from this, and again, a little of Ivanhoe.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
Flynn avoids it. Like Errol Flynn
Mhm.
doesn't go on the Crusades. He's very much the isolationist Robin Hood.
Yeah, which kind of seems to stand out basically until almost you get to the Robin of Sherwood series in the 80s.
Yeah. I mean, the Crusades is dominant. And it wasn't really, I mean, there's like one novel from the late 19th century called Maid Marian as well, or the Forest Queen, that has Robin as a ex-crusader coming back from the Crusades. So it's there, but I do feel like Fairbanks is probably the one that really made it the default version.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. I think that is definitely one of the major impacts and legacies of the film. Another one being just the visual look. I think would be fair to say that the bicocket, the pointed Robin Hood hat, really became popularized in the American or in the general consciousness due to this film. Does that seem like a fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, it was in the stage tradition. It was in I think the earlier films too, but this would have been, I mean, until Errol Flynn came along, this was the Robin Hood, really. And then Errol Flynn had pretty similar costumes. So, yeah.
Mike brought up a good point in the chat that there were a couple other examples in the 20th century with Robin not going on crusade.
Yeah, the Disney ones. And I love in the Disney cartoon that it's Sir Hiss who hypnotized Richard to go on crusade. That's the motivation for it, is hypnosis from the villain.
I feel like it's also a little trickier for Disney to sneak a holy war into one of their movies.
Yeah.
It's a little outside their comfort zone.
Yeah, they had no problem with that in the 1922 there. How do people feel about that? You know, starting with this glorious scene of the men marching off to war, and you know, and how Robin is conflicted about not wanting to take Richard away from the important crusades. That's not something that I think has aged especially well.
It's interesting given that it's right after World War One, which is, you know, just 4 years after, which was the messiest war. I mean, it's not like World War II that's considered the great, you know, glorious cause.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, that's, I don't know how audiences would have felt with that, you know, at the time. I mean, I think the statement right at the beginning is like bringing the Middle Ages to life, bringing that pageantry there. And, you know, when I was watching it again, I was thinking of what Mark Twain said about blaming Ivanhoe for the start of the US Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
He said that whole sense of chivalry and medievalism came from Sir Walter Scott. And I did think about that a little with this.
Yeah, I think that's a really kind of fair moment. And it's one thing that I really like about the 1922 movie is that opening where we see the castle and the ruins and this element of we are taking you back in time. You know, the works of men are ephemeral, but we're going to turn back the pages of history. And that idea that the audience is being transported back in time was something they so clearly wanted to evoke. And it was really just 100 years after Ivanhoe came out, which really popularized the idea of the historical novel. So I think it still is that kind of burgeoning sense of escapism.
Yeah, there's an opening quote in the film, and I don't remember it verbatim, but it basically says something along the lines of like, we're taking you back to really remind you of like what the medieval world was, but we're also telling this story which is like fiction, so we're going to blend fact with fiction, and it's kind of like a way of like having their cake and eating it too, which I think in some ways that can be fun if you're just doing like a silly, you know, Robin Hood story, but yeah, it can also be a little dangerous if you start throwing in like real propaganda and, you know, the whitewashing of history and stuff, which definitely, yeah, as Kristen's comment about propaganda for World War II and just other things that films have been used for. That's interesting about Ivanhoe. I never thought about Ivanhoe as being like something that was a psychological contributor to the mental state of people going into Civil War. But yeah, it definitely was the first time that I remember seeing that quote and being like, oh, that's interesting. Like, and just there's more to that than just hey, you're about to watch a Robin Hood movie. There's also like a cultural communication that's being delivered there, which yeah, I don't know how well that'll age, but but it's okay if the film is still like fun to watch, you know.
Nate, as somebody who has written Robin Hood stories and incorporated elements of the Crusades, do you want to chime in here?
Well, I mean, it kind of goes back to the same idea that what I think the average person off the street who's not a Robin Hood fan would consider to be canon Robin Hood. A lot of those elements are in this movie, right? And similar to what you said about the Costner movie, like that one hits all the right beats of what we expect from Robin Hood. And it's almost like any story that doesn't hit those beats is seen as the derivation at this point, regardless of whether or not any of this is accurate or historically possible or anything. Like this is what we think Robin Hood is, and that's compared back to this like cultural canon. So for me, I felt it absolutely necessary to include that because that's what people think they want, and when we don't see that, I think it goes off the rails. Like I think a lot about the Scott Crow movie that was a little bit too far out of what people thought they were going to get out of a Robin Hood movie, and the fact that it ended up being full prequel and we didn't see a lot of the things that you expect to see, I think contributed to why people didn't like it. And that's okay. That might be Douglas Fairbanks' fault, right? Because they set up what the rules of Robin Hood are that somehow we all still abide by as being the norm.
Yeah. And even as Alan was pointing out, the Errol Flynn movie, which was of course hugely influential, doesn't have him as the returned crusader. Like it gets all the rest of it. The Crusades are still in there. Richard returns from the Crusades. John is conniving while he's away. It twists that one thing, but the rest of it is so familiar that it still is there.
In fact, the writers were very of the Errol Flynn film were pushing back against the Douglas Fairbanks film. They said something that's basically Ivanhoe with Robin Hood showing up for the last 20 minutes to justify the title. I think he actually shows up in the last 50 minutes to justify the title, but I think they said 20 or something. But yeah, and they were very just like the original draft, against their better judgment, they did put in a tournament scene to the Errol Flynn film, and they said they argued against it and said, if you put this in, then what are you going to do for the climax? I mean, and that Fairbanks had this problem and they didn't have quite the same money, and where how do you climax if you start with the grand tournament? So that was their arguments, and then it actually just came down to budget with that one, that they didn't have the money or the time for the tournament scenes, so they cut it.
Yeah, I will say that the tournament scene was one of the things that caught me the most by surprise in the Fairbanks film. A Robin Hood that is presented as that knightly and who jousts, like that is not the weapon. That's not, the association we have with Robin Hood. We think of him as the bow or perhaps the sword. And he's not heavily armored, but Robin Hood in this movie spends more time wearing chainmail than he does dressed as Robin Hood.
Well, then you get an army of people dressed up as what we think you dress up as Robin Hood up at the end to come and save him.
Yeah.
1,000 Robin Hoods coming in.
And by the way, Nate, I noticed that King Richard has a double, so to speak, in this one, though maybe unintentionally so, just like at the beginning of your novel.
That was not an intentional steal on my end.
I meant more that it was an intentional double for Richard. I'm not sure if that was meant to be a decoy or if the jester was just like to sleep in the king's bed, and it didn't pay off that one time.
That jester was quick to jump in the throne the second anytime Richard stood up.
I thought that was a very well done bit of filmmaking there. As you say, the jester was quick to jump in the throne, so I think they set up very well. Like, here's the playful jester, this is the jest he likes to make. And then that made his death later like fit. Like it was some very tight storytelling, I thought there. It's a well done film in many ways. And we talked about some of the spectacular and the moments earlier and how beautiful it was. And Mike was talking about that and the stunts and everything, and they're incredible. But a lot of the scripting and pacing is also pretty well done too.
Yeah, I was wondering why they like brought the fool with them to like the Crusades, and then he got killed, and I was like, oh, okay, I get it now. He was a plot device. Got it.
Yep. Convenient jester.
Well, Richard needs his entertainment on the Crusades.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. So how about Marion? I know, Emily, you said that you were going to have thoughts you wanted to share with us about the presentation of Maid Marian in this film.
I always have thoughts to share about Marion. So I actually really like Marion in this film. I think at the beginning, before you really get into the plot, there's a little concern that she'll just be ornamental and very pretty, but and she is very pretty, and I love that. But throughout the film, she's instrumental, heavily on screen. She does a lot. She fakes her own death and successfully hides away. I think she's really cool. She does kind of walk the line between being very active and then also at other times quite passive. But I also don't mind that either. I really enjoyed seeing Enid Bennett in this role. I think she did a great job. Some of her costumes, I think there's one where she's kind of in polka dot, which kind of make me laugh, but like, that's okay. They're still interesting to watch. So overall, I think this was a really strong Marion, and I think I've said this a few times elsewhere, but there's really very few Marions that are truly just passive. There are so few Marions that actually, do nothing within the plot. And I think it's great that in this, which is our earliest surviving Robin Hood film, we can see here also is a Marion who is active and important and doing a lot. So
my note watching it yesterday was I noticed that she knew right off that Prince John was bad, and she went to plea on the behalf of the poor and things, whereas Olivia de Havilland's Marion kind of needs Robin Hood to open her eyes some extent to the suffering. So I really like that this Marion really knew what Prince John was about, really had the concern for the people, and was willing to speak up right from the get-go.
Yeah.
There's also, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
There's a title card that I really loved. It's during the sequence where Robin is still on crusade and Marion is in the castle and kind of standing up, for the people a little bit. There's a title card that says "That Maid Bears Watching." I liked it so much I wrote it down. I'm like, yes, she does.
Yeah, that's pretty good. I think that the presentation of Marion also very much fits the mold of what we were talking about in terms of the film sort of setting the pace and setting the expectations going forward in popular media. You can really see a lot of Olivia de Havilland's Marion and Enid's there. And I'm also brought to mind, in particular, of the Star Trek Next Generation episode Cupid, where Q turns the members of the Enterprise into characters from Robin Hood. And he says, "What is Robin Hood most known for?" And Geordi says, "Stealing from the rich and giving to the poor." And Q says, "No, no, no, not that." And then the next thing, the second thing that Robin Hood is known for is rescuing Maid Marian from Nottingham Castle. And I think this film really did kind of help set up that mold of Maid Marian as a princess who gets rescued. And as you say, you know, it does a disservice to just cast her in that light as a helpless damsel, because she is an active character in the film, and she does, you know, even fake her own death. She escapes from the castle herself to begin with, and she gets recaptured later. But, you know, she is not just a passive person. But she does have that kind of fairy tale princess quality to her, and the way that the film is shot really frames her in that sort of way. And I do think that really did a lot to set the mold and get into people's minds that that's who Maid Marian is.
And I think
Does that
part
mean
of
that I should be furious with them? Because that's one of my least favorites. Robin Hood tropes is Marion stuck in a tower,
Yeah,
waiting to be rescued.
I really feel that's Rowena and Rebecca again from Ivanhoe. You know, that is really, watching it again, just the influence of that, and how the Robin Hood legend took on that weird fusion of Robin Hood who's in the novel and Ivanhoe, and kind of jumbled them together into this composite figure.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair comment.
I think part of the reason, with your reference about it being, you know, the thing, or one of the things that Robin is most known for, is that often in the films, it's part of the climactic part of the film. It's right at the end. It's part of like the final castle battle, you know. So
it's there in that Costner film, like I was saying.
Yeah.
It's like it has the most beats in common with the 1922 film.
And also with the Robin Hood legend, robbing people is a little problematic after, you know, those early gangster films of the 30s. So I wonder if it's more him as the rescuer and things became something that was better for mainstream Hollywood in sense. You know,
doing it for love rather than for money.
Well, I mean, less scenes of him robbing from the rich and giving to the poor, and more helping women, you know, which doesn't overturn the establishment as much.
So one of the things that caught me a little bit by surprise the first time I watched it was the question of Robin Hood's motivation. You know, he wasn't so much motivated for helping the poor, or you know, he was worried about Marion and that wanted to send him back to England. But when he was there and acting as Robin Hood and he thought Marion was dead, what really prompted him to become Robin Hood was trying to preserve Richard's kingdom. It was so very much about wanting to keep England safe for Richard and, you know, work against John. And that caught me by surprise, was how much they leaned into that as Robin Hood's motivation.
Yeah, that's definitely an enduring element as well. The camaraderie between Robin and Richard as both of them are seen for some reason as unbelievably good people, and that's followed through in almost every version. Any version that Richard shows up in, that's there.
A lot of them, at least, and certainly up into the 2000s television series, I was kind of taken aback that series would have such an unambiguously heroic version of Richard for something that modern.
Found odd because he like leaves his country to go on the Holy Crusades, and it's like you're leaving your people behind and everything, but at the end, yes, you're the hero and everything's gonna be right now. I always found.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's something that tends not to sit well with me. I always really liked probably my favorite episode of the Robin of Sherwood series from the 80s is when Richard comes back, and initially Robin likes him, but then he turns out to be a bastard who just wants to use him. It felt like a very kind of real sort of portrayal of what Richard might have been like. When I was interviewing Michael Menzel, he brought up the point, the game designer who did the Adventures of Robin Hood board game. He brought up the point of Robin helping Richard regain the throne could be seen not about how good Richard is, but about how Robin is an altruistic figure who doesn't want power for himself. And I thought that was at least a fair point, even if the historical Richard probably wasn't so great.
But I
Historical
guess,
Richard was definitely not so great.
but in these ones, I guess it's also that Prince John is worse, though that's a debatable.
Right.
But
Kristen points out in the chat how Richard is also very invested in Robin's love life in this film.
He is.
yeah, when I saw it in Rochester again in 2009, I was seated with two people who since became a couple, and I can't remember which one of them said it to me, but one of them turned to me and said, "I don't understand the narrative here. It looks like first King Richard is a dad trying to get his son to be a real man by getting him a prostitute, and then he ends up jealous of Robin."
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There was a lot of the story seemed to be about the bromance between Robin and Richard there.
Well, I do love the banging on the door at the end, like Huntington, that the last scene is pretty much Richard banging on the bedroom door.
Yeah.
It's so ridiculous.
Which I can only assume was the point, that they were intending to go out on a comedic note, which then kind of undercuts the very romantic note between Robin and Marion. And that final shot with Robin and Marion in the bedroom with the moonlight coming through, to Mike's point earlier, absolutely beautiful, beautiful moment. Like I would love to see a poster of that.
I have one of him leaning into her from that final scene on my wall behind me.
Ah, okay.
Or at least it's from that scene. So
Mm-hmm.
Scene in the beginning of the movie where Robin is like, "Oh, I'm afraid of women," and then there's just a whole crowd of women chasing him around the tournament, and he dives into the moat in full chainmail, and
Yeah.
like swims out and is like, "Oh, another woman," and it was a little confusing, like, and I had to try to ask myself, okay, why in 1922 would the audience have maybe been amused by this, or why was like the creator of this piece of art thinking like, oh, this will be entertaining for everyone?
Persons with official case, Cleveland Institute of Music.
Oh, sorry, but yeah, that was. Did anyone have like a thought on that while we're talking about like the whole aspect of?
I mean,
like,
I will say that one scene of 100 women chasing after Robin, that probably makes this Robin Hood maybe the highest ratio of female to male characters in all of them. So I mean, none of them had names, but there was a lot of them. It was more than just Marion for a brief second.
it is like Beatlemania.
or Elvis. There was Robin.
Yeah.
I think that my best insight in that is just that it has to do with ideas of masculinity at the time, and that there would be something humorous about the character, and I think that they were going with will be popular for our audiences if we show a very heroic, manly figure. We establish how manly he is because he wins this tournament, but then have him go, "Oh golly, I'm afraid of girls." I feel like that's a thing that was also being portrayed in cartoons at the time, to have that juxtaposition of the manly character who then is a wilting flower when it comes to women. I think that is the idea behind the humor there. I did find it, as at least a modern audience viewer, a little bit off-putting tonally. There were a few times throughout the movie where I was like, what is going on? Because they would kind of switch from something that was like, heroic and like these big swelling moments to something that is just madcap and goofy like that. He's being chased by the women. He's being tied up to the pole later at the feast while women all like lavish themselves on him. And then it has a very sweet romantic moment between him and Marion. And then it has these horrible scenes of cruel torture and the incredible melancholy and tragedy when he's been shot in the gut and he thinks Marion's dead. And then it's like madcap laughter again as he's Robin Hood and prancing around. It felt very tonally back and forth. I mean, it's still a very good movie, but it does feel like it was throwing a lot of things out there to see what would work.
Well, this inner title in particular, thus it was that Huntington buried his yesterday. Here began a new life, a life dedicated to revenge, bitter but joyous. Bitter but joyous.
I made a note of that too.
I like to quote from Midsummer Night's Dream, hot ice and wondrous strange snow.
Yeah, it's I think that encapsulates some of the weird total element that they're trying to balance there.
I think one of the funniest gags in this movie, it made me laugh out loud the first time I saw it, was that moment kind of during the feast when I think it's Prince John has taken, Marion out and then Robin follows. And there's that little bit where the prince drops his handkerchief and Robin picks it up and goes to offer it and then throws it back on the ground. I think that's hilarious. I think that was just so sassy and funny. And it's such a laugh out loud moment. So
I think we awarded that wittiest bit of banter on my podcast when we covered the film.
It deserves it.
Got the guy strung up by a bow.
That was a good moment too.
Feels his boots and he puts the boots under a curtain and they're like, oh, there he is. And then they reveal it was just the boots and the guy, and they're like, where'd the boots go? And you see the guy, he's like, I took my boots. It's just such a funny gag to see a guy who literally could just lean back. Like he's not really trapped by the bow, but it's such a funny, it was just cute.
But he's hanging there for like 20 minutes. Yeah. So they don't get him down. They just leave him there and run back and forth.
He could literally just put his feet down and he could stand.
I was gonna say, I think the bit that stuck with me the longest after first watching it was when they just mass murder the guards that are coming through the door to the port or the postern gate, and they just tear the helmet off, kill him, tear the helmet off and kill him. Like they murdered 30 guards in a row, no reason. I was like, what? There's just a pile of dead bodies.
Yeah. And then violence, madcap antics.
Yep. I know. Look, it's hilarious. We're killing all of them.
I think the violence that took me most by surprise is when Robin is like banging that guy's head against the stone step. I think it is.
The fight with Gisborne at the end.
I don't think it was at the end. I think it was kind of in. I can't remember what.
When he's on the castle wall and he's got several people attacking him.
I think so. And it was like when he first showed up at the castle, like dressed as Robin Hood for the first time. And there's that one guy, he like just bangs his head repeatedly against the stone. Like, okay, sure.
They didn't like throw the body over the wall.
I think so.
That guy that he used as an arrow shield, he threw over the wall. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Like boom, good practical effect. Arrow kills him, and then throw over the wall.
Yeah. He's so happy about it the whole time.
He was very happy to throw that guy over a wall. He was like delighted about it. That was your friend.
And then he like poses. He'll kill someone and he'll like pose for like dramatic effect before going into the castle and escaping the guards. It's just
I
so
feel
fabulous.
I feel like you could get drunk within 5 minutes if you did a drinking game based on how many times he does the gymnast salute with that one outstretched arm.
Yeah. It's very, very Douglas Fairbanks there. He is very into his fitness. Speaking of, I mentioned the slaying of Guy of Gisborne there. That one really kind of caught me by surprise. He was really built up to be the antagonist, the primary villain, and I was expecting a really climactic battle between the two of them, and they had one when he, climbed the tower to save Maid Marian from Guy of Gisborne, who has been a thorn in his side for throughout the whole movie. And then it's a very short but extremely brutal fight. One of the most brutal fights I think I have ever seen on film.
Yeah, I remember that and thinking again, like I did with the torture stuff, that this would not happen. But movies had changed by the time of the Errol Flynn film.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a little bit of our language of film and storytelling had changed, definitely.
Well, it's just legally. They locked in films that they couldn't offend anyone over the age of 12.
Oh, yeah. And in terms of the brutality of it, I meant in terms of the, having the climactic showdown fight is such an expected thing now.
And quick kind of follow-up question on that. For Guy of Gisborne, I think, if anyone knows otherwise, please let me know, but I think, is this the first time that Guy of Gisborne as a character is seen in a film? And if so, would this also be like a very vast, different look for Guy of Gisborne than the way he's always been described in the stories, which is he's kind of like a murderer for hire that the sheriff gets to try to fight or find Robin Hood, and he comes in like this like kind of creepy horse cloak with the head still attached and stuff, and they have this duel in Sherwood, and then that's kind of what's been in the stories for so long. But then for this one, I like all of a sudden Guy is like a knight, and he never wears anything like that. But then all the other guys that we see usually on film and TV, they never have the horse cloak. They never are these like mercenaries. They're always like these evil knights. Is this the first time that Guy of Gisborne is translated into this new kind of knightly villain character?
I was wondering much the same also. Alan, Kristen, do you have any insights on that?
Well, I do think that certainly in the 1890 Reginald the comic opera, Guy is like the lackey of the sheriff, and the sheriff is trying to say that Guy is Robin Hood's older brother. He's using Guy to falsely claim the Earl of Huntingdon title. So you do have a somewhat aristocratic Guy of Gisborne back then. And
when was that?
That was 1890. And that comic opera was so influential. I mean, I've seen things from the 20s, the 30s, 40, 50 years later that still mention it because it kept getting revived. I mean, it was revived in LA like a year or so before this movie. And then it would be revived in New York and across North America a few more times before it finally petered out in popularity. But at least on the DVD version and the one I see on YouTube, I noticed at least 3 tunes from the 1890 comic opera that they used. And I realized it once when I was watching, and suddenly the lyrics sprang to mind. And I thought, why do I know lyrics to this background music? And it took me a few minutes to realize what it was from. But Gisborne has some role in that. I'd have to look up, there are 5 silent films before this one?
I'm not sure how many. I know there was that Percy Stowe one. Since they're hard to track down.
Yeah. I looked up the earliest, and IMDb doesn't even have a cast list for it. So I couldn't see if Guy was in that or not.
The novel Robin Hood and the Men of the Greenwood by Henry Gilbert came out in 1912, so 10 years before this film, and that has a Guy of Gisborne in it who is more knightly. He's a landed lord of some sort and one of the antagonists, and they pay an homage to him wearing the horse cloak, because there's a one scene where he's like escaping from a fire and he wraps like the cloak of horsehide around himself to like get out from to protect himself from the fire. And he's not really the kind of primary antagonist in that book, but it is at least an earlier example also of a Guy of Gisborne. I don't know how influenced it was by the opera or not.
Yeah, and I feel like there's a bit of Front de Boeuf and de Brassy in, and maybe less so Bois Gilbert, because I think of him as being a little more sophisticated than this version of Guy. I feel like maybe the Basil Rathbone one has a bit more of that to him, or even the 2006 Richard Armitage Guy of Gisborne has some of that, because there's a bit of the conflict, the emotional conflict in him.
Let's see. Kristen points out the Jennifer Robertson novels from the 1990s also play with the horse cloak as a temporary disguise. How about the Sheriff of Nottingham in this film, though? What a great dynamic character with many fantastic moments.
Did he just show up twice where they had like two inner titles that said the Sheriff of Nottingham or the High Sheriff of Nottingham, to let you know he's here, we have him in this?
Yeah, it's something.
He
like
definitely
that.
didn't have a name. I know that.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like with a lot of Robin Hood films, they'll take the characters of like Prince John and the sheriff and Sir Guy, and they'll like combine them into one, almost. But in this film, we have all three, which is really interesting. But then they might each have smaller roles, like he had like a little like pilgrim hat almost that the sheriff did, and just like popping out of the church and getting shot, and then going back in,
Yeah, it's such a cameo. I mean, even though he's the number 3 or number 4 baddie in the Errol Flynn film, at least he has more to do and more of a recognizable character in that one.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And does he die at the end? He gets mobbed. I don't know if it's implied that he's dead.
I think it was ambiguous, if I recall.
Yeah?
Leah, you watched it most recently.
I mean, knowing this film, he probably died, but
Fair point. Well, I think this has been a very fun discussion. Is there anything else that anybody really wants to bring up? Any points of the film that really stuck with them or they think are worth discussing in regards to the film's legacy?
I wrote something down. So when Robin first comes back from Crusade, it's mentioned that his home has been razed to the ground, and that happened. And I thought, this has really become a trope because that has definitely happened in multiple Robin Hood movies since. And we've already talked about how this, is kind of a default, but that one little detail that they just kind of threw in there, I'm just like, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Hang on, PA system.
I have a question. So Douglas Fairbanks, very famous for being athletic and doing a lot of his own stunts. We see some amazing stunts in this film. I'm curious, what do you all think are some of the best Robin Hood stunts, either in this film or any of the films or TV shows? I genuinely think him climbing up the chain and then him just jumping from one turret to another, those were really like, that's like genuine Assassin's Creed stuff, and he just
Yeah, doesn't he just like haul himself up the curtain at one point too?
Yeah, well, I heard that with the chain, there's a story that they had a stunt double. They said, no, we know you like your stunts, but jumping over chairs is one thing. You're now the big star and head of the studio. We don't want you to break your neck, so we're getting you a double. And then Fairbanks said, I don't like how that double looked. Let's reshoot it. And the next day, the double goes off, and then he comes out and he's like, sort of got his face turned or something. And they're looking at him like, wow, he really looks like Doug. And then suddenly the devil comes out like, yeah, Doug switched with me.
Yeah,
So,
that sounds like a Fairbanks story.
well, I know that him and Alan Dwan did a lot of stunts in their earlier movies and worked it out. And the thing that Dwan said is that he always wanted it didn't have to be the biggest stunt. It was always made to be effortless. So they worked out that, like, if you jumped over a chair, the chair was the exact height for Douglas Fairbanks to jump without even thinking about it. So it looks like there's no effort, no thought. It's just completely natural. And that was what they did with all the stunts. And then, yeah, they had a slide tied to that tapestry that he goes down.
Yeah.
Though I think also in the Black Pirate, when he puts his knife in the sail and goes down that.
Michael just joined the chat. Michael, do you want to introduce yourself and maybe mention your history with the 1922 film? Are you there, Michael?
Hey, Michael, good to see you.
Okay, well, feel free to speak up at any point.
Well, while he is connecting, I'm going to have to make a discreet exit because I got to go pick up my kiddo from school. So thank you all for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
It's great having you. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet all of you. That was fun. Bye.
Bye.
Right. To Mike's earlier question about favorite stunts, the ones in this movie are really good. The Errol Flynn movie is so much the one I grew up with, and that one has some of my favorite stunts, especially when he's escaping from being hanged and he leaps from the platform onto the horse, and he then leaps onto he cuts the rope to drop the portcullis and swings up holding onto the rope. Those are definitely two of the ones that leap.
I made a gif of that one because I just love that stunt of him on the rope going up from the horse to the portcullis.
There's a good stuntmen react video to them watching that movie and being very impressed by what was being done at that time. Meanwhile, Kristen also in the chat has been giving some good recommendations for some more female-centric retellings of Robin Hood. There are those Jennifer Robertson novels from the 90s and Diane Carey romance from the 80s. I'm not familiar with this one either, called Under the Wild Moon.
I think I have a copy and I've never got around to reading, even though I've met Diane Carey at Star Trek conventions, because she wrote a lot of the best Star Trek novels back in the 80s.
That Robin Hood novel is sort of a bizarre mess of all kinds of medieval things tangled together. There's capital letters, the old religion in England, and so on. And she's throwing her own original characters into it. But it's kind of a fascinating, well, it's sort of a mess of medievalism, but it's doing some interesting things. The main character is a female blacksmith, and she ends up falling in love with Will Scarlet, not Robin himself, although Robin and Marion are around, and at one point get very angry with Will for bringing this outsider into the Greenwood. There's this real kind of fascinating family dynamic with the outlaws that's going on. You almost get a sort of older brother, or very paternal Robin. It's like, Will, I don't want you to be with this woman. You know, she's an outsider. She's not one of us. But of course, your heroine proves herself and her worth and so on.
Sounds similar somewhat to the Robin McKinley book in some ways.
You can squeeze it into an area of 135 centimeters.
Are you there, Michael?
Be like a micro. You just tiny mini shower rooms. I just tried to keep the shower and toilet over that side. Pressure was over there, so it's going to be I mean, the layout there makes complete sense.
Yes,
You are
yeah.
definitely a plumber. You've got all the drainage, all the water, everything on one side.
Sounds
Yeah.
like a television show in your background,
Yeah,
Michael.
Take 12 bucks, not stack.
Right. That's going to look super small on the outside. That is legit.
All right, I muted Michael. Michael, if you want to come back on, pop a message in the chat or something. Sorry about that. Regarding Will Scarlet, and although I did want to mention in regards to the 1922 film that one of my sort of disappointments with it is how little we got of the Merry Men in almost any way. They basically get, except for Little John, get cameos.
And they have no idea who Robin Hood really was. Like
Yeah, I suppose
Friar Tuck did not know that he was the Earl of Huntingdon when one of the nuns recognized him.
I forgot about that. That's a good point.
There's
Yeah, he's
this-
just the mysterious bandit leader even to them.
There's this whole scene where like they introduce Will Scarlet and like they have the title cards and everything, and they introduce like Little John and Friar Tuck, and then they don't really do anything. The rest of the film, like they'll be at Robin Hood's encampment, but even when they're like taking down the castle, I don't think we see them that much, which is really tragic because Will Scarlet has like this epic cape and like cool hat, like this whole cool outfit going on, but then his character just like isn't really in the rest of the film.
I just remember Alan Adale wagging his finger at them when his hat was shot off his head.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there's some very, very brief moments, but it almost feels like celebrity cameos or something. Like, hey, it's Will Scarlet, it's Alan Adale, you know who these guys are, you love them. But we don't need to bother actually doing anything with them or introduce them or show who they are as characters, because you as the audience are just expected to know who they are, I suppose.
And I think most people would have in 1922. I'm not sure how well people know the Merry Men today.
Yeah, I feel like they've been getting a bit of a short shrift in a lot of the more modern adaptations.
I mean, I assume Robin Hood Maid Marian, Little John, and Friar Tuck are probably universally known in English-speaking things, and then Will Scarlet's and Alan Adale less so, and then much, not so much.
Yeah, I think when I was talking with Andrew West, who does like Robin Hood plays in Sherwood, he was talking about like the big five, and I think that was Robin and Marian and Little John and Friar Tuck, and I think Will Scarlet might have been the fifth one, just like for like pure name recognition.
I feel like there was a time where Alan Adale kind of eclipsed Will, and they kind of go back and forth as to who would be the fifth one.
Yeah, I think that might be fair, especially because Alan Adale has something easier to latch onto as a character. I think Will Scarlet is the most mutable as all of the kind of big name Merry Men. Like, who is Will Scarlet? What kind of character is he like? Is he a kind of foppish dandy like he is in the Howard Pyle retelling and in some of the early films? Or is he like the really gruff, angry guy like in the Robin of Sherwood series? Like who is the Will Scarlet character? Like what do you latch onto with that? What is his defining feature other than, I don't know, maybe something red?
But you get to the Star Trek episode Cupid, and as Data just goes, just as Geordie's mandolin signifies that he's Alan Adale. That's all you need. Flop an instrument in his hand and you know who it is.
Right. But with the mandolin and like suddenly you have an occupation, and oh, now he's a bard, he's a minstrel, and oh, we can assume he's a romantic figure because that's something we associate with them, and that perhaps he's a little bit more artsy. There's things to go off of with even just having that one little prop. But with Will Scarlet, it's like, oh, he wears red, I guess.
Yeah, and his love story, Alan Adale's love story, was common in some of the plays. It's a dual love story along with Marian.
Yeah. And yeah, so he also has a defining story coming out of the ballad tradition, and Will Scarlet doesn't so much. But he's got a cool name, so I think that's why people recognize him.
I think the name is really good there. But yeah, and then Much is definitely, I would say, he's obviously the next one people know, but not anywhere near in the league of the others.
Yeah, and I don't think he even got a cameo in the 1922 film.
No, I don't think he did.
We get a little bit with Friar Tuck because he has the fight with the disguised King Richard, and he's there, like you mentioned, when
He likes
Robin
spanking people, as I recall.
Yeah. And we got almost nothing with Little John when he was Little John, but we got a lot with him earlier when he was being Huntington's squire.
Yeah.
But just about nothing for any of the rest of them. Which
I agree with Mike's comment here in the chat that Skippy the Rabbit in the Disney cartoon is Much.
I could see him as the Much of that film.
Yeah,
that works for me. Even with some of the flaws of the film, in terms of wishing it had more merryman, the tone can be a little bit off. There are times where it is surprisingly violent. It is definitely one of the Robin Hood movies that I would recommend to others to watch without reservation.
Yeah, I just wish that they would bring it out with a better, not maybe a different score, just a better realized version of the existing score. Because the one we have, I mean, I think they call it the Elton Thomas Studio Orchestra in the credits, and Elton Thomas being Fairbanks's middle names, and his alias that he used as the writer of this film. That's what he used. But I think that it was just 90 synth. It was like, say, 1995 MIDI adaptation of the score. And I think that if you went back and had the kind of orchestra and the Wurlitzer that they had at the Egyptian theater and put it on a proper score, it would probably sound a lot different. Because I heard the recording of one of the themes in that, and I was like, is that actually in this version? I'm like, yeah, I think it is. It's here kind of, but I can't really make it out because of how it's done.
Have any of you ever gotten to see a silent film with an orchestral accompaniment?
Yeah.
What was it? How was that experience?
When I was growing up, the theater downtown, they used to have like nights where they'd have a silent film and have a guy on the not an orchestra, but on a can't remember the word, an organ playing along with it, and those are really cool. I think I saw like some old Buster Keaton film, but
I've seen this one with a live orchestra, but the one time where they had, I think, their own unique score is also the time when I had stayed up to 4 a.m. the night before writing my conference paper. So I don't actually remember much of that experience.
I've only done it once. I went to a screening of Metropolis, Fritz Lang's Metropolis, that had a small orchestra accompaniment, and that was an amazing experience. I absolutely adored that. I would love to find something like that for this film. I think it would be well done. It should just be sweeping and moving.
There was actually, I think, for about 20 minutes while I was watching it last night that I decided to kind of experiment a little bit, and I had Spotify open and I muted the YouTube video, and I just kind of went through the Korngold score and like picked and chose like whatever tracks I thought would match up. And that actually really added to my experience for those 20 minutes. It was really fun. But it was also a lot of work, and I kept having to stop and start while I was like picking different tracks to go with the new scenes. So I kind of gave up on it. But it was really, it added a layer to have such rich music with it.
Yeah.
So it was
Yeah, I
really
could really
cool.
see how the Corn Gold score from The Adventures of Robin Hood would really fit that well.
I
How-
think this movie was like 100 years ago.
Yeah,
Just even think like this is like if you were a normal person living 100 years ago, this was what Robin Hood was at like the peak of human storytelling up to that point. There were video cameras. There wasn't like sound for voices yet, but they could put people in costumes and put them in front of a camera and record it, and people could go sit in like a theater and watch it, and it made like crazy amount of money. It's wild to think how many like now normal things of Hollywood, like the red carpet premiere and just all like this, it all started with this movie, and it was like it's 100 years old now, and it just is wild to think like let's hope humanity survives another 100 years, but if we do in another 100 years, like what is the experience of Robin Hood going to be like?
well,
You know,
will you be celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Taron Egerton film?
Oh,
yeah,
I suspect most people don't even remember it. Just like the Russell Crowe film.
yeah,
If I say it to people, they're like, Russell Crowe did Robin Hood?
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's like we also like it's easy for us to look back at this movie 100 years ago and be like, oh yeah, like here's what feels strange or silly to us, but it does make me wonder, like, you know, with what I wrote or Nathan's book, which I loved, like in 100 years, what will that book be to someone, or what will my play be to someone, or yeah, what will, like, you know, the Russell Crowe movie be to someone? Will they be watching, be like, wow, like this, you can tell this is such a 2010 thing, or like it was clearly trying to do the superhero movies of that time, and I don't know. It's just
Yeah.
it's so
But-
surreal to think about. We're looking back on something 100 years old, and what will Robin Hood be in 100 years, and what will even be the experience of Robin Hood be? Is it like, is it not even gonna be movies anymore? Is it gonna be like a live VR walkthrough of, I don't know, like it is just surreal, like 100 years.
That might be the issue, though. I mean, I feel like the Errol Flynn film still sticks in the popular memory because I saw it when I was like 8 years old or something on TV, and it's no different from The Wizard of Oz. I mean, it was made what, 1 year before The Wizard of Oz, I think, or around the same time, and you know, Technicolor, same kind of aesthetic, and it's just something you accept as a kid, and you know, you would see it more old fashioned as you got older. And I think even kids today can just fall in love with the Errol Flynn Robin Hood or the Wizard of Oz and accept it. Whereas a silent film that's in black and white, that would be harder to connect with people. Just,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, the Jazz Singer was 5 years after this film. So
Yeah. One thing that I've definitely taken note of is how much Robin Hood is a popular story that basically whenever there's a new form of media, Robin Hood gets adapted to it. You know, the first historical novel, or what gets credited as the first historical novel in Western literature anyway, Ivanhoe, has Robin Hood as a prominent character. You know, he was, as theater and plays were becoming popular in the late Middle Ages, there were Robin Hood plays. Part of the ballad tradition, you know, or even before this 1922 film, there were Robin Hood movies. You know, some of the first television shows were Robin Hood television shows. You know, Robin Hood cartoons, Robin Hood board games when board games started becoming a thing. Some of the very earliest video games were Robin Hood themed video games. Whenever there's a new media, Robin Hood is quick to be there, and this is kind of an important part of the history of that.
in a couple of YouTube videos, I've noticed there were two separate ones that turned it into a woman Robin Hood at a university campus rebelling against the system. And also, I think YouTube itself produced like a Robin Hood in the Future cartoon.
Yeah. Yeah, the Sherwood animated series for their kids channel.
Emily, was it you who? I don't remember if I don't know if you'd read it, but like you brought it up. There's like a Robin Hood remix novel where Robin is actually a during the Crusades, and Robin's like
yeah.
a Muslim fighting against Crusaders, and like the merry
What's it
band is
called?
actually a bunch of Muslim
Trap.
fighting against. Like I'm like that's an incredibly fascinating like way to repitch Robin Hood. Like
Travelers
is.
Along the Way. I've just been reading that one.
Yeah.
got it.
I haven't
Sounds
started
awesome.
it yet, but I'm very,
Amanja
very excited.
Amanja Mi Safi.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Like,
Mhm.
let me know when you're done reading that one. I've got like a big Robin Hood list I'm still trying to get through, but that one's definitely on my like want to reads.
Well, I told Nathan I was reading Nottingham after this one. So.
It's really
It's
good.
it's such a good way to flip the script
Yeah.
and kind of take this trope of the Third Crusade that has since become something that we can acknowledge was bad. It was bad, not a great moment in history, but to be able to take this Robin Hood trope and turn it back into something that we can like look forward to and kind of be interested in the different ways that it can explore the story. I'm really excited to read it. I think it's on my Kindle right now. So
Yeah, it is fun seeing, Robin and her band robbing the Templar Knights and giving to the less fortunate in their area there. In the chat, Kristen recommends KJ Charles's The Gentle Art of Fortune Telling, which puts them as Regency era con artists. Which also sounds like that could be a very fun remix as well. I'll need to look that one up. I was not familiar with that one. So to get back a little bit to our 1922 film, before we go, Mike, you have a film review podcast that you're a part of where you give movies grades. How would you rate the 1922 Douglas Fairbanks and Robin Hood if you were to be rating it on your podcast?
Oh man. Well, my podcast partner Champ would really love it if I stopped bringing Robin Hood up in every single episode. It's called Second Day Film Podcast. College journalism buddy of mine started it, and I jumped on when he just needed someone else to talk to. Podcasts apparently work better when you have multiple people on them. I guess I would give for what it was, the 1922 Robin Hood, Douglas Fairbanks in Robin Hood, that's the technical title because of copyright reasons, I guess. I would give it an A. I would not give it an A+, but I would give it an A for what it was at the time. I think overall it was very well made. There was, incredible stunt work and beautiful cinematography, and I think if it came out today, it would probably get a lower score. But for the time it was, I think that it did very well. I'll give it an A. Good job.
All right. Did anybody else have any other thoughts they especially wanted to share about the film?
Actually, no, A-, because I don't like how long it took for him to get to be Robin Hood.
That's true. It is over halfway through the film before it becomes Robin Hood. You can kind of see how with more recent adaptations, they start with him coming back from the Crusade as opposed to starting with him leaving for the Crusade.
Yeah, that is, that's certainly like in 1938. Then they really had an issue with the fact that Robin Hood wasn't in Douglas Fairbanks and Robin Hood. But I don't think Fairbanks is 100% sold on Robin Hood. So
yeah, I read something about that he was hesitant to play Robin Hood. What do you know about that, Alan?
Well, the famous quote is something like, "I don't want to play some flat-footed Englishman traipsing around the forest," I think is the line that he has, or heavy-footed Englishman. But I know one story says that I heard in a book from the early 50s about it, claims that he was on the fence and then he commissioned them to build the castle set and then it's like and then he still wasn't sure, and maybe they could sell it to another movie or something, which seems to me a little nuts given how big that set was and how extraordinary, and it was coming out of his own pocket to just be like, I'm not sure I'm going to do this movie, I may or may not, let's just spend all this money to build a film set. It just I don't know. I haven't gone to rereading a more recent Fairbanks biography because I'd be interested to see what they say, because that story strikes me as not being 100% accurate.
Is it true that he shot a guy accidentally?
Yeah, in New York.
Like,
He was showing off, and the newspaper one day says like some furrier or something got an arrow in his butt, and they thought it was pranksters, and then they realized it was at the same time that Douglas Fairbanks was showing off shooting arrows into the sky in New York. and apparently like the thing he wanted was tickets to the premiere to be Douglas Fairbanks. That was his out of court settlement.
Oh my gosh.
reminds me of that episode of Seinfeld where Kramer's just randomly hitting golf balls into the ocean and not thinking about, like, is he like hitting a whale? Douglas Fairbanks is just on some roof, like, where are those landing? I don't know.
I gather that people sort of felt at the time, oh, that's just Doug. That's that it just seemed to be his reputation.
Mr. Fairbanks, you've shot someone in the chest. Oh, that's so him.
Well, though again, you could wonder if that was maybe all orchestrated, you know.
Yeah, immersive experience.
I don't know if I want to go through the immersive experience if you're gonna get shot. It doesn't sound super fun.
They say don't meet your heroes. I mean, I don't know that they meant it that way.
I played with the idea of, like, if I ever got to do like a live staging of my play, like, what if we had someone come in and be like, just ask people for cash, like during the show. It's like, hey, you're here in Robin play, like, hand over your cash now. We're giving it to the poor. And I don't know if like the idea would have worked as well, but sometimes like there could be something about an immersive experience to Robin that could work and be legal and safe. But yeah, I don't know.
I know one time when they're filming Robin of Sherwood, I think it was Jason Connery shot a camera and had the arrow like go right into the camera lens, not on purpose. It
was there a cameraman right behind that lens?
Yeah, I gather there was.
Oof.
Yeah, so
because
it was on like the bloopers, but it wasn't set up to like be usable for film, because I mean that would have been a great shot if it was perfected in a way to actually do it.
Right. If you were willing to buck the cost of a camera lens and you just had it filming remotely so there's nobody behind it, yeah, that would be a really cool shot.
Yeah, well, I know that Howard Hill, like, they paid people for him to shoot them in the Glenn film.
Mm-hmm. And how he was, doing the trick shots from off camera.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite things about that film.
But yeah, the Fairbanks, by the way, I think the reason the title is Douglas Fairbanks and Robin Hood is I think it's Three Musketeers, much like Robin Hood had earlier shorter silent films. And when Douglas Fairbanks's version of that came out, some of the studios that didn't want to pay the licensing fees brought out their old version of Three Musketeers and showed it and almost tried to trick people into thinking they were getting the Fairbanks one. So by putting Douglas Fairbanks in Robin Hood as the title, that is sure that you were getting the Fairbanks version.
Speaking of archery and Fairbanks and the sort of person he was, there's so little archery in the film, and I know he was apparently showing off at that New York party or whatever, but it makes sense to me that he wouldn't want a lot of archery in the film because that's like external to himself. he wants to be leaping around. He wants to be sword fighting. He wants to be wrestling. He wants those really active things. The idea of targeting somebody from a distance feels very anti-Fairbanks to me.
Well, and I think it carries on in the film tradition, like with Errol Flynn and such, that if you want to fight your bad guy for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, a bow is not the weapon you should be using, because that'll be over in very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Any other kind of last comments that anybody wants to make? Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining. I had a lot of fun. It was nice seeing some of you again. Nice getting to meet others of you.
And if we do this again, I will try and get I'll hook up my laptop and actually do it properly, because it's very nice to meet some of the people that I've talked to on Twitter in person, or well, at least seeing you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It would be really great to do some in-person meetups at some point, or even just more virtual ones like this.
It was
And-
mentioned one time the Cleveland Public Library does have a very, very extensive Robin Hood collection. I've been, it's pretty cool.
And was it around, like, the last time I was in Cleveland was, Jesus, when was it? Like 2002 or something, when I visited my friend who lives there.
I can't remember when they acquired it. But I know they've had it for a long time, because for as long as I've been searching the library catalog, when I was a kid looking for Robin Hood books, like Cleveland Public Library just, all of their special collections listings showed up. So they've had it for a long time. They probably had it in 2002.
Yeah, the Toronto Library, there's an Osborne collection of children's stuff that has some of the ballads, like from the 1700s, the original editions, and most of the children's books that, you have to go in with gloves and touch them. And
Oh, that's neat.
yeah.
All right. Well, thanks again, everybody. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your evening, wherever it is you happen to be.
Yeah, thank you. And I hope we can do this again.
Yeah.
Thank you, Thaddeus. This was wonderful.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Good night, everyone.
Night.
Right.
Good night.